Good morning and welcome to the Eclectic Radical. It's great to be back after after my hiatus. Uh, as always, I'm Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical, and with me today is my colleague and frequent collaborator Youri Smouter, the host of the 1+1 program on YouTube. How are you doing today, Youri?
Thanks for the invitation. It's always an honor to be here, Chris. And yeah, I'm doing fairly good. Doing fairly good. Apart from the world being on fire, I am planning on going to visit some comrades in London from July 25th to August 3rd. Of course, a little bit of like travel jitters, travel anxiety always, but doing good though.
Doing good is good. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah. And yes, and on the program, really looking forward to this because I pitched you this idea. So for those who follow your program and my program, as everybody should know by now, we're both lefty history buffs and whatnot, and I've been very fascinated by three pieces of history which often actually don't get looked at enough, even by the best of the left, and that is the George McGovern campaign, the Walter Mondale versus Reagan campaign, and the Michael Dukakis campaign. And I want us to, of course, with our critical leftist perspective, to examine those three moments in history and look at why the Democrats. Why the Democrats lost, and I know for a fact we'll probably be, we'll probably also be examining what was the media environment at the time, how much did the media have an influence, the union movements, and so forth. So really looking forward to it.
That's what I thought. All right. So the McGovern campaign is a great place to start, though it's worth giving a little bit of history to how people got to the McGovern campaign.
Please do.
From the Great Depression and the 1932 election, the Democrats had pretty much been the ruling party of the United States, whether they were in the White House or not. And the set policy of the United States was New Deal liberalism per FDR. Even when Eisenhower succeeded Truman, you did not really see a major upset of the New Deal status quo. In fact, you see Eisenhower, who was always conservative in his impulses and liberal in his politics. You see Eisenhower choose to become a Republican because he doesn't want Douglas MacArthur to take over the Republican Party. And then you see Eisenhower govern the Republican Party like FDR. And so
the richest during that time paid taxes. Personal income taxes in the 90s.
It was under Eisenhower's administration that the liberal consensus in the legislature passed the highest progressive tax rates in history. Which Eisenhower, was not aggressively against. And Eisenhower said very prophetically, and something that Republicans listened to for years and years and have only now changed their mind on. But Eisenhower said, Social Security and Medicare are the two most important things in the history of America, and only really crazy people and a few Wall Street billionaires actually want to get rid of Social Security and Medicare.
Yes. Yep. Indeed. And I think he once said something vague. Well, I'm trying to paraphrase what Professor Chomsky said, but apparently he also once said that anybody who even questions the New Deal is just out of this world, not to be taken seriously.
I mean, Eisenhower really thought that the New Deal had become the basic social model for American democracy, and that was where both sides should be coming from. He also had ideas about the Cold War that were more reactionary. But the important thing to understand is even on the Cold War, Eisenhower was more a continuation of policy than any sort of serious change in policy. Eisenhower's roll back the Iron Curtain wasn't that different in practice from Harry Truman's containment when you really got down to it. And Eisenhower, like you said, he thought the New Deal, like we were saying, he's based in the New Deal. He was followed by JFK and LBJ, who also supported and expanded the New Deal. And then you have Nixon. And the reason you have Nixon is not so much because of opposition to the New Deal or opposition to the Great Society, really.
Yeah.
But opposition to the Vietnam War and support for the Vietnam War, allowing Nixon, as many people often did, to present a far-right imperialist position of foreign policy as, basic American patriotism. We can't give up on our allies. We've got to fight communism. So we have to keep fighting the war, blah, 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 blah. And Nixon's re-election in 1972 it comes down to a lot of the things that happened in 1968. And in 1968, Hubert Humphrey, who was LBJ's vice president, was fundamentally undermined by his assumption of a pro-administration. We've got to follow the policy we've got in Vietnam position that undermined all of his liberal positions.
Yeah.
And Nixon was able, more than opposing the liberal positions, Nixon was just sort of playing up patriotism and playing up law and order and playing up the fear of the social order breaking down and saying, hey, we need coherent foreign policy and cops to be safe. And people bought it up because patriotism. And also 1968 was the first year in office of a Democratic senator named Thomas Eagleton, who would end up being the first of a series of sort of white conservative Democrats who had more of a problem with the New Deal and the Civil Rights Movement and the Great Society than Nixon did.
Interesting.
Thomas Eagleton was one of the first, this civil rights and New Deal stuff is going too far, Democrat. He was a Cold Warrior. He was a Vietnam vet, not an anti-war Vietnam vet like Kerry. He served as senator from Missouri, I think. Yeah, senator from Missouri. So he's the reason for Missouri becoming red as he became increasingly as politicians like Eagleton became increasingly unattractive to working class Missourians whose interests they were no longer representing. They became replaced by even worse Republicans.
Okay, so he wasn't one of those Democrats that you could call Dixiecrats, and not one of those.
Well, he was pretty close to a Dixiecrat. I mean, he fundamentally supported Nixon's position on the Vietnam War, despite being McGovern's running mate. He was an aggressive border hawk who was worried that McGovern was going to give amnesty to illegal aliens and draft dodgers. He was a big police booster who was greatly concerned about the quote-unquote drug crisis and a drug warrior who thought that McGovern supported the legalization of acid. And he thought that McGovern was too pro-abortion. And he said all this off the record to a reporter during the 1972 convention. And while he was not quoted with his name attached, he was quoted without attribution by said reporter. And, and the line, "I don't know what McGovern supports, but amnesty, acid, and abortion," ended up being picked up by the Nixon campaign as a slogan. And then, of course, McGovern ended up in trouble over, "I support Eagleton, he's a hero," despite Eagleton not supporting him when Eagleton's history of depression and mental health treatment came out. And ultimately, McGovern ended up looking kind of unsympathetic and mealy-mouthed when he dropped Eagleton from the ticket for being disabled and not for being disloyal.
Well, I wasn't planning on even getting to that point just yet, but I did write in my notes in preparing for the show that I actually really did not like the ableism and marginalization of McGovern's running mates that he faced for being hospitalized for mental health reason. And I also thought that it was disgusting and a damn shame that Hunter S. Thompson of Rolling Stone magazine was piling up on that, given Hunter's widespread use of drugs, as well as being, if you want to even call him, a functioning alcoholic. And yeah, anyways, that's...
Well, I mean, let's face it. Let's face it. Hunter Thompson was self-medicating for his own mental health issues on a massive scale. This is not a bad thing. He did some excellent work. But it just goes to show that even people who are themselves clearly struggling with a disability can be extremely ableism about other people experiencing the same struggles, especially if those people are in some position of authority. But I mean, it's interesting, though. Eagleton should have been dropped from the ticket for being a disloyal conservative scumbag who didn't support any of his running mates' actual policy positions. And if McGovern had been willing to do that or willing to refuse to take him as a running mate in the first place, it would have been so very different than looking like a guy who was unsympathetic to his running mate's mental health issues.
I mean, well, actually, okay. Let me respond to that first before we get back to McGovern's failed bid and so forth. I just find it strange that you listen to like a lot of American culture, which is music and stuff like that. It's the same thing with with British culture and whatnot. A lot of the songs, I mean, a majority of songs, if they're not about falling in love and being happy about falling in love, it's a lot of the songs are about heartbreak and the depression that comes with that. There are so many songs which even deal with mental health issues, and you would think at a time where whatever was the new term of shell shock.
I struggle to disappear. I have to disagree. I will say there are lots of songs that deal with mental health issues. They're just never really presented that way.
Yeah, exactly. So all that being said, I always find it I always find it strange that all communities, but even communities that deal with intergenerational trauma, it could be my people, Black people, it could be the Latino community, it could be any community in which that has had to deal with so much trauma, intergenerational trauma, that how mental health can be a taboo subject, I still find that
So,
quite
so the thing is, you gotta understand that capitalism, okay, the work ethic, the capitalist work ethic, as originally communicated by Calvinist Protestants from some of the most work-obsessed countries in Europe, and who still think Americans work too hard. That's the thing to really understand. The countries in Europe that invented the Protestant work ethic still think Americans work too hard. But that aside,
yeah,
you've got this Calvinist, the Calvinist work ethic is a macho ethic. The Calvinist work ethic is I'm going to go to work no matter what. Because, my dedication to work is my dedication to the Lord, and I'm just that tough that I'm going to keep going to work for the Lord.
And there is, and not just, and I think, let me just say, like, a lot of male communities do have that kind of, like, machismo.
Well, have you ever heard that?
I call it machismo nonsense. That kind of like masculinity and so forth. So,
well, you ever heard the T-Bird song from the '80s, "Tough Enough"?
Which song?
T-Bird song from the '80s, "Tough Enough."
No,
'80s pop music. So I don't know how big that one was in the rest of the world compared to some others. But the T-Birds were an '80s rock band with a lead singer who looked. The best way I can describe it is Fat Elvis if he was young and from New Jersey instead of the South. But anyway, one of the lines in that song is, "I work 24 hours, 7 days a week," because he's trying to impress his potential girlfriend with how tough he is.
Yeah,
And that sort of macho-ness, you can't admit weakness. And mental health problems for men are an admission of weakness. They're an admission that something is wrong with me and I can't perform my best and I can't do my job. And that is the ultimate failure under the American macho work ethic system. That's why now you're seeing all this ridiculous people should go to work sick bullshit in the wake of COVID, because they know people will eat that up with their macho. Yeah, lots of people were already working sick out of some stupid macho idea that they needed the money and couldn't afford to lose it.
Yeah,
and that somehow that one day of pay would end up being more important than their health, which is not to minimize economic need. But I've been evicted because I haven't been able to work because I'm sick, but I've never been evicted because I missed work on one specific day.
Unbelievable. But you did bring up a very good point, that if mental health is a taboo subject, even amongst communities which do suffer from intergenerational trauma, blame that on just the macho patriarchal bullshit and all of that.
Well, and
nonsense.
When we're talking about patriarchal Calvinist Christianity in the United States, we're also talking about white supremacy and the way that patriarchal Calvinism is pushed on Black people and immigrants and brown people in a way that is designed to make them more American than the Americans, to paraphrase Cromwell in Ireland.
Yeah. So I'm really glad she brought that up, because that's always something that's gone under my skin when even doing when even trying to do deeper dives into why the McGovern campaign lost. That just always bothered me, that everybody.
That was one of the first things
that had
that was one of the first things my mom said, and it was with my mom. It was even simpler. With my mom, it was he should have just kept him on the ticket. and never said anything, or he should have just dropped him from the ticket and never said anything. And to actually talk and then drop him from the ticket after saying he wouldn't was just going to be bad no matter what.
And the fact that like the American public and like the media definitely played like a leading role in this, but the fact that like you can marginalize somebody who was a vet who naturally had PTSD,
I mean,
and that you can marginalize him for that.
So let's talk about the Vietnam War. Let's talk about the Vietnam War. I mean, we use this language about Israel now all the time. And I think it's worth using this language about the Vietnam War too, because of some of the war crimes committed. And that is, oh, you have PTSD after killing babies? I should hope you would have PTSD. If you didn't have PTSD, there would be something even worse wrong with you. So, yeah, no, I mean,
go ahead.
The last thing that we should be surprised about when we send young men who believe they're patriots off to another country to commit atrocities for America is, yeah, they're going to have mental health issues when they come back. Now, those mental health issues are still, less urgent than the atrocities they're committing overseas in the first place. But it's natural that the people who are committing atrocities for the empire are then having mental health issues because of it. What else are we going to expect? But the idea that people who commit atrocities for the empire should be proud of it and not have mental health issues about it is also baked into this whole macho bullshit. It's almost like the atrocities are the problem in the first place, and they don't want to talk about that.
Well, I wasn't going to bring him up, but isn't one of the reasons why John McCain was so widely popular was that he was one of those Vietnam vets that did not join the anti-war movement. In fact, he was proud.
Well, the reason that he was so popular was because of the mythology that he deliberately stayed to be tortured out of loyalty to other POWs, and that he supposedly refused chances at being released ahead of schedule because he wanted to be loyal to everyone else and didn't want to jump the line. But in the end, he jumped the line. I mean, he was sent home. He was sent home in order to feed the mythology of the lost POW myth that we still have people in Vietnam. I mean, he's been selling that. He was selling that line of bullshit his whole life.
Even more mythologized by
the Chuck Norris movie as real history that has been a problem since the Reagan administration. But it starts with Nixon. And the reason I went back to Nixon is because it was in 1972, because of factors of their own making, that the Democrats first found themselves as an opposition party to a really conservative Republican Party that they really didn't disagree with as much as they pretended to.
Interesting.
Eagleton was specifically chosen to be McGovern's running mate as a vote of no confidence in McGovern. We're deliberately giving our anti-war vice president a pro-war running mate who's a war hero, and our anti-war presidential candidate refuses to say, well, this is why I'm against the war, because of the mental health problems it causes people like my good running mate, Tom Eagleton. And he missed that chance and instead created his own problems.
But also, McGovern's an interesting person because unless I'm wrong, he was always against the Vietnam War from the start, and was
Yes.
one of those and was one of those anti-communist leftists that basically believed, look, Vietnam has the right to its self-determination.
Well,
if they want a communist government,
you could
by all means, we can
argue.
have it, but we shouldn't be like.
I don't believe this. I think that this is going too far. I think it's more of an opportunist thing than a real conviction thing. But McGovern was one of the last liberal politicians to really engage with the new left in any way during the late 60s, early 70s. He talked to a lot of people. He was kind of out of touch and didn't have a clear idea of what things actually cost sometimes. He had an idea. He had an idea to replace a lot of welfare programs that gave people money for food or for housing with what he called the demo grant, which was sort of a universal basic income pilot program. It was nowhere near enough money to replace everything he said he wanted to use it to replace. So it was kind of more of an attack on the welfare state than the sort of really left idea that it could have been.
Okay, interesting.
But he was, the things that are fair to say about McGovern is he was against intervention in Vietnam from the beginning. He was a World War II vet who opposed both the Korean and Vietnam Wars.
Interesting.
He was generally considered the most legitimate social democrat leaning candidate for the Democratic nomination in 1968.
And for our international,
which is the year RFK was shot and Humphrey was nominated and Nixon won.
Yeah.
And McGovern lost to Hubert Humphrey and Eugene McCarthy in that convention, while the Chicago PD beated the police protesters who were there to support McCarthy and McGovern out in the streets. So there's something symbolic about that, in that people who were there essentially to advocate for McCarthy and McGovern against the Johnson administration were beat up by the Chicago cops, even as the anti-war candidates were gamed out of the running at the convention.
Then I have to ask this question: do you think the corporate and state media, so like PBS, NPR, had any role in McGovern losing? Because when researching, I found out Nixon got 753 newspapers who endorsed him. McGovern only got 56, and then there were several newspapers who did endorse either candidate, but I don't know if they leaned more towards Nixon than McGovern. And curious if, looking back, was corporate media like ABC, NBC, CBS, and to a degree PBS, were they fair to both candidates, or
let's start right off the bat and answer that question.
Yeah.
Nixon's candidate was Spiro Agnew, who Nixon's vice presidential running mate was Spiro Agnew, who would go on to plead guilty to serious corruption charges while vice president, and who was potentially the most corrupt governor of Maryland ever. And when we talk about most corrupt governor of Maryland ever, where there's a lot of competition, Maryland is one of those states with an awful history of the worst machine politics. So when we talk about Spiro Agnew's unique and special corruption compared to the rest of Maryland politics at the time, it was really out there. I mean, he was being given bags of money in the governor's office, and even after he had moved up to VP, he was supposedly being given bags of money in the VP's office in the old executive office building. So I mean, I'm not a big Rachel Maddow fan, but Rachel Maddow's podcast about the Spiro Agnew investigation is worth listening to. Just because the history of how fucking corrupt Spiro Agnew was, and the fact that he was the quote-unquote liberal Republican who ran against the pro-segregation Democrat governor, but then became a vocal supporter of cops and a vocal critic of the civil rights leaders. Even while generally supporting civil rights policy, he was extremely vicious to civil rights leaders in a very racist and nasty way that sort of undercut his pro-civil rights political positions. He was one of the first Republicans to really attack the press for being partisan and democratic.
Or too liberal, which is what...
He may have invented the terms liberal media, which is hilarious because Agnew was widely seen as a liberal. He was on Nixon's ticket because he was more liberal than Nixon on a host of issues. But his ultimate role as vice president was as this loudmouth creep who could say the most horrible things.
Interesting. Very interesting.
And so you've got all of that. But the media made it about McGovern's running mate and not Nixon's running mate. I mean, let's start right there. It was the media that chose to make Thomas Eagleton's mental health an issue in the campaign. The media didn't choose to make Spiro Agnew's rather cartoonish, corrupt racism an issue of the campaign.
And do you think Hunter S. Thompson's also guilty of that? I've not read his book about the 72.
Well, I mean, Hunter S. Thompson
he himself also piled on marginalizing Eagleton's mental health issues, which I find gross hypocrisy.
I think with Hunter Thompson, and I'm not meaning to defend him because this is an accusation too, and I see other people online. I see people online do this a lot. People who think they dislike people for the right reasons will sometimes sound just like Nazis talking about those people. And I think Hunter S. Thompson, being the sort of extreme personality that he was, thought that he could use this rhetoric without fear because Eagleton was such a terrible person that he didn't deserve any sympathy. And that McGovern was such a terrible person for palling around with Eagleton, no matter how reluctantly in the first place, that he didn't deserve any sympathy. That Eagleton just, hey, this is the most convenient way for me to beat them both with a rock. So Thompson's like, this is the best way for me to beat them both with a rock, as not being sufficiently what we need right now.
Shame.
I mean, there are people who have, sometimes it can be really tempting to do things because of ego sometimes, and really hard to know whether you're doing things because of ego or whether you're doing things because of principle. And sometimes people do things out of principle because of ego. My ego won't let me compromise on my principles in this case. Not to say that we should compromise our principles, but principles and ego can be mutually reinforcing.
Mm-hmm. But back to the media, both like the newspapers and the broadcast media, on why McGovern lost.
Well, the media also was fine promoting the American working class as viciously pro-war. The media still frequently uses the public opinion polls to cast the American working class of the Vietnam period as viciously pro-war, and frequently blames McGovern for losing Democrat support, except if you look at the 1972 elections, the Democrats who won office and were going into Congress in 1973 were universally anti-war, and that didn't stop them from winning elections. But what they also had in common, in addition to being anti-war, is being more capitalist in their orientation than previous Democratic candidates. One of the new congressmen from a a well-off district in California, was a bank president who put a "Stop the War" sign up in front of his bank.
Interesting.
So
Very
you
interesting.
got a bank owner running for Congress as a Democrat, pretending to be a liberal opposing the Vietnam War, but he's really a bank president whose actual policies aren't in any way appealing to unions.
So you think? So do you think there was a lot of deception because the common the common knowledge was that McGovern was appealing way too much to the youth vote and not enough to the old school working class people who they're for the New Deal, but they still want to contain communism overseas and yada yada yada, all that stuff.
Well, I mean, elections aren't won and lost for the most part on foreign policy. Elections are won and lost for the most part on do I feel safe at home, and do I feel like my monthly bills are something I need more help with. And that's usually what elections come down to, regardless of the rest of the rhetoric involved.
True.
And people make a choice, a not always educated choice between candidates from the two major parties, based on who does the best job of pandering to their anxieties, both physical safety and economic safety, and isn't sufficiently critical about what both major parties agree on and which promises both major parties keep and break.
Interesting.
I mean,
very true, though. Very accurate, though. Very true.
Because if you look at Carter, who's the next Democratic president to come along after Nixon, the stage was set for a very different sort of presidency than Carter actually ran. The stage was set for let's expand the EPA, let's expand the civil rights functions at the Justice Department and shrink everything else. Let's expand the human rights stuff at the State Department and shrink everything else, which Carter paid lip service to, but didn't really follow through on in a meaningful way.
Yeah.
So many things that they could have done. And instead, Carter lectures the United States people about, balancing their personal budget a little better.
Yeah, no, very much so. It was one of those typical things where some liberal, or some left-leaning liberal, but they wouldn't call themselves left. But anyways, one of those things where you talk left, you campaign left, but you govern from the right, basically.
Well, my parents, my mother, who supported Jesse Jackson in '84 and '88, was extremely upset by having to, as she thought it, vote for Mondale if I don't like Reagan, because she remembered Mondale was Carter's vice president, and Carter hadn't been all that good at keeping his most important promises to Democratic voters.
Okay, actually, before we pivot there, let me just add this. Before we pivot to the Mondale v. Reagan. So Nixon got 753 newspapers who endorsed him. McGovern only got 56. Yep. And then there were several media outlets which didn't endorse either. And I'm trying to figure out if they leaned more towards Nixon and McGovern. When researching McGovern, Wikipedia said the following. McGovern ran this is in the section of called Issues and Strategy, and said the following. McGovern ran on the platform of ending the Vietnam War and instituting a guaranteed minimum income for the nation's poor, which you already talked about. The Vietnam issue, which remained the one McGovern was most passionate about, did not work for him overall. A majority of the electorate thought that Nixon was a strong leader who would secure peace with honor. Dumbasses. McGovern, in contrast, was seen as too strident, too tied to the radical elements of the anti-war movement. Nixon's strategy of Vietnamization had resulted in the withdrawal of most U.S. troops without appearing to have given in to the communists, and thus popular dissatisfaction with the war did not accrue to McGovern's benefits. And then it also said Nixon's so-called Southern strategy of reducing the pressure for school desegregation and otherwise restricting federal efforts on behalf of Black people had a powerful attraction to Northern blue-collar workers as well.
And McGovern did not, if you want to criticize McGovern for anything, you can criticize him for not sufficiently speaking up for civil rights and considering the civil rights battles already won.
Interesting.
Of course, the Southern strategy and all its law and order bullshit was an anti-civil rights argument, and McGovern didn't want to approach it that way. Which, none of the Democrats since have ever wanted to approach it that way in the way that they should. Even as recently as 2020, Bernie Sanders was saying he wasn't going to defund the police.
Yeah. Exactly. Unfortunately, that's where we get into the bizarre world of what's called dog whistle politics. So when you talk about law and order, yes, I mean, so when you're talking about law and order, that's basically a dog whistle for keeping the niggers and the spics in lines, making sure that the fags don't get out of line and that they stay in the closet,
and helping our friends.
Occasionally, we will talk about serial killers and so forth, but it's basically a dog. But basically, the dog whistle is we got to keep the hippies in line. We got to keep the Black people in line for all of the rioting and other.
And let's remember that the unspoken punchline to all of these anti-Black dog whistles is also because if we give Black people anything, we're going to be asked to give poor white people stuff too.
Exactly. That's always the fun, and that's always the funny thing when the dog whistle of going after welfare cheats or the undeserving poor. Oftentimes that translates to the undeserving Black people, the undeserving brown Hispanic people.
Why did the Nixon administration...
Native Americans are also given too much, but it's mostly targeted towards Black people. And when the policies are enacted of going after the welfare cheats and stuff like that, it disproportionately, yes, it impacts my people very badly, but it also disproportionately hits the poor white folks.
Well, remember, it hits when you hit poor people. It guarantees that it disproportionately hurts Black people because there are more poor Black people in proportion to the total Black population. But it also hurts poor white people because the plurality of the poor people in America are still white because of demographics. And we have a country that doesn't like to admit that. They love to forget rural Appalachia. I'm sorry, Appalachia. My apologies. They love to forget rural Appalachia. They love to forget the class immiserated Rust Belt, where people who were told they were middle class now have gone to being unemployed and small landlords and small business owners in order to try to maintain their class status in all sorts of ways. It really ends up hurting a lot of people. And people who vote for it often hurt themselves because nobody pictures themselves as being one of those people. When you say the very term "those people" implies that you mean someone other than yourself and the people you're talking to. But the problem is that far too many people who don't think of themselves as part of those people are part of those people to the ruling class. When the ruling class talks about the middle class, they mean the poor millionaires. The poor millionaires who just haven't become as rich as the mega millionaires and billionaires yet.
Of course, we have the New Deal to thank for what's called social mobility. So people who came from poor working class backgrounds once upon a time, now they were still working class, but their standard of living certainly increased.
Well, some of them experienced real class mobility.
Yeah.
An excellent example is that Joe Biden's father, who never got a college degree and who was working class for long periods during the Great Depression, became a successful used car dealer after the World War II ended, was able to give Joe Biden a Corvette for his 18th birthday, and
of course,
was able to get Joe a spot in a state school, despite the fact that he didn't have great grades. And, Joe Biden didn't want to cancel anybody else's student debt, despite benefiting from state school at a time when, that was the only way that was the way you went to school if you didn't want to pay for it.
Mm-hmm. Also, back then, we already mentioned how during a Republican Eisenhower administration, the rich actually did pay a lot in taxes.
Yes.
It was in the 90s under Eisenhower. Mr. Kennedy and the Johnsons kind of lowered it to both 60 and then 70. Nixon kept it at 70.
The big cuts all came under Carter and Reagan.
And back then, wages did actually increase when the cost of living would go up. So that's also a very important footnote, because all that shit completely goes down the reactionary belt.
Bill Clinton's so-called middle-class tax cuts actually cut the highest marginal rates more than Reagan did.
So that's a very segue. Let's fast forward in history time. So Nixon was president, did make some major concessions to people power movements. He had the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. He had the Endangered Species Act. He once, when inflation and the economy kind of went bust, he actually did institute price controls and so forth. The
1972 Civil Rights Act was Nixon.
He once famously said about Milton Friedman and others who wanted him to install austerity and so forth, he once famously said, "Fuck Milton Friedman. He doesn't have to run for re-election, and we are all Keynesian now."
Yes.
Then comes Gerald Ford. So that's a one-term president. Many people were very angry that he pardoned Nixon, so he becomes a one-term president. And then that gives us the rise of Jimmy Carter, which you already talked about.
Even more than Jimmy Carter, what's important to understand about Gerald Ford's presidency is that Gerald Ford's presidency also saw the rise of Ronald Reagan.
Yeah.
And Carter was the Democrats' Reagan.
So do talk a bit about that before we talk about the Mondale versus Reagan campaign and why Mondale.
In 1976, Ronald Reagan runs against the sitting Republican president for the nomination on the basic position that the Nixon administration had conceded too much to liberals. And he takes on a really aggressive platform that appeals to the Goldwater people on foreign policy and to the George Wallace people in the Democratic Party, some of whom had become Republicans.
Was Nixon's Southern strategy.
So Ronald Reagan in 1966 unites the Barry Goldwater and George Wallace wings of conservatism under one anti-communist, anti-black, anti-queer, pro-church banner.
Exactly. And Reagan
it's worth to note
and
that
Reagan did awaken
the
a terrible
1976 primary. The 1976 primary shows the politicalization of two groups that had not participated in Republican politics before. Number one, it showed the active politicalization of the conservative Christian voter as a Republican voter as opposed to a conservative Southern Democrat voter. The moral majority, which was created in 72, 73, 74, really flexes its muscles in the 76 primary. And a lot of the money for the primary, for Reagan's campaign in 76, comes from not just anti-communists, but literal anti-Soviet Nazis from former Russian territories living in states like New York and New Jersey and California. And lots of them bundle money for Reagan in 76 and 80. And this really shows the influence of what we can call Nazi money in the Republican Party on a large scale for the first time since World War II and Charles Lindbergh.
Yeah.
And so that 1976 Republican primary is the rebirth in a serious way of American Nazism as a national political force.
And when we talk about the Christian far right, the Christian evangelical movement, and the moral majority, interesting to know that Jimmy Swaggart passed away not too long ago.
Yes,
and I don't know how I missed this news, but in June of 2023, Pat Robertson also passed away of the 700 Club. Very, very far right Christian douchebag. You can, any insult you want to throw at him, Pat Robertson does that. Pat Robertson fits that. So Reagan had awakened this god awful toxic politics, which we are still.
And it was Reagan who really gave us the modern Christian Republican Nazi. And the Reagan Democrats, as we call them, there were some actual Democrats who were elected in those years who were Reagan Democrats, but really the Reagan Democrats were people like Joe Biden and Paul Tsongas, who had been elected before Reagan took office and were sort of waiting there to collaborate with him when he got there. The reason Jimmy Carter won the Democratic nomination in 1976 more than anything else was that he got George Wallace to come home to the Democratic Party and endorse him instead of Gerald Ford.
Oh, wow.
Wallace had endorsed Nixon in 72.
Unbelievable. It's funny.
And if you watch the movie about George Wallace with Gary Sinise,
with Angelina Jolie
and George Wallace endorsing Jimmy Carter.
Wife, correct?
What?
Angelina Jolie played his wife in that.
I don't remember. I've actually never watched Wallace. I don't really care for George Wallace. What I know about it from Cliff Notes and from critics' responses to it. And it's like, no, I'm not going to watch this. But the popular way of presenting George Wallace coming back to the Democratic Party and electing and endorsing Jimmy Carter for president is George Wallace gets shot, has a reckoning with mortality, and decides he was wrong to be racist. No.
Yeah.
There's this big redemption story, George Wallace coming back to the Democratic Party because he's not racist anymore. When what it really represented was Jimmy Carter making noises that he wanted to make nice again with people like George Wallace.
Interesting.
I mean, because let's remember, and I have to say this in as clear a manner as possible. Whose labor did peanut farmers traditionally depend upon in Georgia?
Answer.
Well,
I don't know.
before the Civil War, peanuts were a slave plantation crop.
Interesting.
After the Civil War, and this is why George Washington Carver is such a big deal, after the Civil War, peanuts were primarily grown on plantations very similar to the slave days by sharecroppers who were renting the land in return for a share of their crop. The reason George Washington Carver believed all these peanut products could successfully build a black economy in the South was because black people had all the peanuts. Not literally, but black people grew all the peanuts and kept a share of all the peanuts because of the way the farming system worked. And if a way could be found to make money off peanuts, by gosh, we can really create a black ruling class.
So the Carter years, that's fascinating. One of these days, we actually should do an entire show about Jimmy Carter because it is fascinating. Because you always hear different stories. You have some people who paint Jimmy Carter as this leftish liberal, others who say no, he was always way too centrist for his own good, and others who say he was. And others who
all
say
the good and bad. I mean, Jimmy Carter,
a right winger on socioeconomics as well as a right winger on foreign policy, and he kind of pivoted more towards anti-imperialism when he becomes ex-president.
Jimmy Carter is like Harry Truman in that he is a white Christian farmer from a traditionally vaguely Southern, or in Jimmy Carter's case, actually Southern state. Remember, Truman, like Eagleton, was from Missouri.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so Jimmy Carter really is this sort of Truman-style traditional Christian Democrat who's conservative in what Americans tend to call the best way and liberal in what Americans tend to call the best way. And really that means he's an obnoxious centrist who's conservative in a lot of ways. But I mean,
in other words, if he was a European,
the best thing you can say about Jimmy Carter is he was a serious enough Christian that after he got out of the White House, he has spent the rest of his life trying not to go to hell.
Exactly.
In the immortal words of a now disgraced comedian, he's old. He wants to go to heaven.
Which comedian was that?
I'm not going to name him because I don't want to endorse him.
Okay. Perfect.
Very big when I was a kid and ubiquitous on television, and at least 2 wonderful television properties have been poisoned by his disgrace.
All right. Well, you already sort of alluded that when Jimmy Carter was president, it was one of those disappointing things when you elect a party like the Democrats or a left-leaning party because they talk a little bit about governing from the left, but they actually govern from the right. You already explained actually perfectly how Reagan got into the White House. Look, the Republicans are very good at animating their base in that respect. So on to the Walter Mondale versus Reagan bid. This is why I had prepared in my notes. So Walter Mondale, he was the vice president under Jimmy Carter. When he was running in the Democratic primaries to be leader of the party, the major union that actually endorsed him was the AFL-CIO. The National Organizations of Women actually supported his bid. Yep. When the choices was between him and Reagan, he got the endorsement of the National Education Association and the Alabama Democratic Conference. He beats people way more to the left than him, like Gary Hart, George McGovern, and Jesse Jackson, who you talked about.
It should be noted that Gary Hart was a neoconservative whose whole political career was based on the Clinton, what would become the Clinton strategy of going after Republican issues, mostly national security related issues, and trying to make them Democratic Party issues. He was a triangulator and a we need to be less liberal guy. And so it always amazes me when people talk about him being to Mondale's left, because he was actually the sort of anti-Jesse Jackson candidate in some ways. The thing about Gary Hart, and I think this is the reason he was seen as liberal, because the U.S. just has this idea of JFK as more liberal than he was, and JFK is a womanizer, and thus every president who is a womanizer must also be a liberal.
Exactly.
Now, JFK's womanizing was actually greatly limited by the back pain caused by his Addison's disease that caused him to use a wheelchair in many situations when he wasn't in front of a television camera or near a reporter. But the myth still exists, and the myth seems to have been more true for Gary Hart than it might have been for Jimmy Carter. The reason that he was, even if the monkey business scandal was completely concocted by Lee Atwater as alleged by Gary Hart apologists today, it still comes to the fact he was known for being a womanizer who attended parties, and that wouldn't have worked if he hadn't a bit. But he was a right winger. He was a right wing foreign policy think tank guy who was basically, Democrats need to worry about the Cold War more. Jesse Jackson was the only good primary candidate in that batch. McGovern's running was in many ways an insult to Jesse Jackson. He should have kept his ass out of that race. And I will never get enough about saying this, because this is the real redemption story from the civil rights movement and not George fucking Wallace. The only white Democrat with any sort of national political stature to endorse Jesse Jackson in 1984 and 1988 was the former segregationist governor of Arkansas who did his face-off with Eisenhower over Little Rock High School, Orville fucking Faubus. Orville fucking Faubus endorses Jesse Jackson in 1984, telling poor white people in the South, your fortunes are linked with those of poor black people, and anything that's good for poor black people is good for you. You need to vote for Jesse Jackson.
Interesting.
Literally taking the complete opposite of his position during the segregation era and telling working white people in the South, you need to vote for Jesse Jackson. Everything that's good for poor black people is good for you too.
That is very fascinating.
That is the real segregationist redemption story, and you never hear anyone tell it because they're too busy trying to rehabilitate George fucking Wallace.
Interesting.
You got a real story like that, but remember how much Democrats actually hate people like Jesse Jackson.
Well, funnily enough, and I actually do have something about Jesse that I do want to talk before we even talk. Well, actually, Jesse is going to come up when we talk about Dukakis, but let me get to this. So when running against Reagan, Mondale, apparently his campaign, from what I read, was very bad when it came to organizing events and just basic communications with the public.
They're just very bad. Mondale's campaign was just very bad, just like the McGovern campaign was just very bad. I mean, it's very hard to say anything good about those campaigns.
However, but during his bid to the White House, he did get endorsements, and you can respond to this on whether you think the media played a part or not. But he did get endorsements from these major newspapers: the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Detroit Free Press, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the Arkansas Gazette, the St. Paul Pioneer Press, Minneapolis Star and Tribune, Tallahassee Democrat, St. Petersburg Times, Beacon Journal of Akron, and the Ohio and Milwaukee Journal, although its chairman backed Reagan, and the Louisville Courier Journal. Now, listen to this.
Question.
Listen to the endorsement. But listen to this.
Is the LA Times on that list? I'm guessing no.
The LA Times I don't think was on that list, but listen to some of the endorsements Mondale got. So when the New York Times editorial board endorsed him, they liked his policies on reducing nuclear weapons, as well as boring economic stuff like the deficit. The Philadelphia Inquirer said the following, which I thought was interesting. Said the following: the Reagan administration ignores or rejects or simply stands ignorant of the institutionalized poverty and hopelessness eating at the bodies and tyrannizing the spirits of millions of Americans trapped in the backwaters beneath the national economic and social mainstream. The deeper essence of that administration has been racism with a smile. And the Washington Post said the following about Mondale: that Mondale has been maddeningly misread and mistreated by the political trend markers this year, just as Mr. Reagan has been maddeningly indulged and overpraised. Is unambiguously the better candidate, talking about Mondale. And the Detroit Free Press said Mr. Reagan, far from being the guardian of fiscal responsibility, has virtually destroyed whatever vestige of it there was before he came to office. Mr. Reagan's cheering assurances that everything will work out fine are not believable.
You notice that these endorsements are saying we think Mondale's actually a better fiscal conservative than Reagan.
Okay, explain that before I get to this part. Go.
So you're saying, see, we're talking about Reagan, and they're saying Reagan's idea. It's ridiculous to say Reagan is fiscally responsible. He's blown that away. We're endorsing Mondale because, no matter what somebody says about him, he's going to end up being more fiscally responsible than Reagan, because look at Jimmy Carter. Because let's remember, the whole problem with Jimmy Carter is that he was fiscally responsible and it was bad for the voters, and so the voters voted for Reagan instead.
If you're going to, if your choices are between Diet Coke and Coke, you might as well just drink Coke, as the old saying goes, or a version of that saying goes.
But I mean, but yeah, it's like Carter. I mean, if you want to actually talk fiscal responsibility, which isn't worth doing, because fiscal responsibility is a lie when it comes to politics. None of these people are fiscally responsible. But if you really want to talk about fiscal responsibility, Jimmy Carter is the beginning of the Democrats trying to do more austerity than the Republicans while pretending not to.
Interesting.
Jimmy
Yeah.
Carter is really doing Jimmy Carter spends a lot of his time doing fiscal responsibility. The reason he put up solar panels on the White House was to save the U.S. government money.
Not for
eco
reasons.
I'm not going to say that he didn't care about good reasons. I'm sure Jimmy Carter was concerned about global warming and, or the economic issues of the time. As far as environmental stuff goes, Jimmy Carter was better than some of the presidents who came after him. But I mean,
damning with faint praise.
Yes, of course. But if you look at that fiscal responsibility, the myth of fiscal responsibility, then Jimmy Carter was more fiscally responsible than Ronald Reagan, hands down. And the reason that all these liberal newspapers were endorsing Mondale and not Reagan was because they thought Mondale was going to be more fiscally conservative than Reagan. Because Reagan wasn't being fiscally conservative. Reagan was cutting welfare and putting the welfare money into the military. That's not fiscally responsible. The military ends up costing more. Every dollar you spend on welfare saves you money down the road. Every dollar you spend on the military costs you money down the road.
If only the editorial members of and the many columnists and opinion makers that are in all of those corporate
let's be honest,
magazines would actually say that.
When the New York Times was saying that Walter Mondale would be more fiscally conservative than Reagan, what they were talking about, even though they didn't come out and say it, was that Reagan blew up the defense budget, and they thought Walter Mondale might trim some of the fat out of the defense budget.
But how would you talk? But actually, before I ask that question, let me just actually add this. So, but apparently Reagan got the endorsements, unfortunately, of most newspapers, or at least major ones. And apparently,
sure the LA Times endorsed him, which is hilarious. Because at the time, while the LA Times ownership was conservative, the LA Times editor-in-chief was Robert Scheer.
Exactly, who was one of the few voices. If you watch
one of the reasons that the quote unquote left-wing media trope was possible was because whether you think he's super good at it or not, which lots of people can debate, Robert Scheer was actually a Frankfurt School Marxist. Still is.
Yeah. Fascinating guy, by the way. I should try to invite him on the show in the future. But yeah. But apparently, yeah, so as I mentioned, Reagan got the endorsements of most newspapers, or at least major ones. And apparently, even when he got endorsements, or when Mondale got endorsements, the editorials weren't enthusiastic about the choices, which apparently was an attitude widely shared by the American public.
Well, just think about that.
Regardless, Reagan got the endorsements. These are some of the ones that at least were available. Was the Chicago Tribune, San Francisco Examiner, New York Daily News, Cleveland, Ohio Plain Dealer, Columbus Citizen Journal, Sunday, Oklahoma of Oklahoma City, Pittsburgh Press, Albuquerque Journal, the Indianapolis Star, the Richmond Times Dispatch, Denver Rocky Mountain News, South Carolina State, Los Angeles Daily News, and the Lexington Herald Leader.
Okay, LA Daily News, not the Times. Okay, that's interesting. That's good to know too.
But in terms, but also in terms of when we talk about broadcast media and we talk about radio, do you think that the corporate media was fair on both Walter Mondale?
I mean, the corporate media. If you look at the ones the Democrats lost, McGovern, Carter's reelection, Mondale, Dukakis, Gore and Bush was the first one where the media really preferred Gore to Bush in an obvious way.
Okay, interesting.
It was really cast every election I can remember, as far as Reagan versus Mondale, Bush versus Dukakis, Clinton versus the first Bush. These were all cast as, these are terrible choices. We shouldn't have to choose either one, but if we have to choose somebody, we're going to choose so-and-so. And Clinton was the first time that any of the people endorsing the Democrat really seemed excited about it. And it turned out it was because Clinton was even more conservative than Carter.
Interesting.
Let's remember, who did Clinton run in the primary for, both the first time, both when he won the Attorney General's office and the first time he won the primary for governor. Who did he beat in both of those primaries? You mentioned this name before on this show already, this episode.
Oh, okay. Come on. Sorry, completely blanking.
So Clinton was running for governor of Arkansas against a guy who was saying Anything you do to help the poor black guy is going to help you too. Orville Faubus.
Okay.
So Clinton beats Orville Faubus in the Democratic nominations. And while it is played as this victory of a new Democrat over the old segregationist, the actual fact is that Orville Faubus was running as the closest thing to a communist you're ever going to see run for Democrat in Arkansas. And Bill Clinton was the conservative candidate. And you never hear this story told on any sort of serious level in the Democratic Party because, once again, despite his segregationist past, Orville Faubus was telling people, vote for me. I'm going to help the poor black man, and that's going to help you, the poor white man.
Well, this is the perfect segue to the Dukakis campaign. But before we get there, let me just read this. So Mondale lost in the landslide to Reagan, unfortunately. And when reading about his campaign on Wikipedia, why he was thought to have lost, Wikipedia says the following. Soon after the election, Democrats offered multiple theories for why Mondale lost in the landslide. Jesse Jackson, who ran the primaries against Mondale and got second place, folks.
Yes.
This is very important.
They were seriously worried about Jackson winning the nomination in both 84 and 88. Supposedly in 88, they had Mario Cuomo ready to launch a surprise candidacy at the convention if Jackson won enough primaries to be the favorite coming into the convention.
Fascinating. Well, Jackson said regarding why he thought Mondale lost, he argued that the Democrats had pandered too much to white men.
Yes.
Mondale himself said in February 1985 that he lost because of his inability to appear compelling on television. William Raspberry disagreed with Mondale's self-assessment and argued what cost Mondale was the perception that Reagan, while perhaps on the wrong side of a number of specific issues, generally stood for what most Americans stood for, while Mondale, though often on the right side of the specifics, didn't really stand for anything at all. Mark Shields of the Washington Post, which did endorse Mondale, said the following: the single biggest mistake made by candidate Mondale and his campaign was the failure to endorse and embrace the fair tax plan of Senator Bill Bradley, Democrat of New Jersey, and Dick Gephardt, Democrat of Missouri. Chris, I'm curious, your critical leftist historical assessment of Reagan v. Mondale and why Democrats
the fair tax.
And before we get to Dukakis and Jesse Jackson, what was the broadcast and again, was the broadcast and radio media fair to both candidates or more?
Well, what we're talking about right now, the fair tax. They're talking about the fair tax. What was the fair tax? The fair tax was a tax cut scheme so that the rich could pay less.
Interesting.
All tax fairness legislation in the 1980s came from the agreed upon consensus that the income tax marginal rate was too high and needed to be lower. That's why when Clinton came into office, he cut those marginal rates even more than Reagan and said he was doing it for the working class.
Or the middle class.
The middle class, sorry. Who was the only president who actually raised the marginal rates between Carter and Obama?
George H.W. Bush?
Yes. That's right.
Even though he ran, read my lips.
And he raised the marginal rates because he realized, oh my gosh, there's too much inflation. We need to raise taxes a little bit on rich people. That's the best way to fight inflation.
But Chris, but does that go back to, okay? So when when people read specific major corporate newspapers who might endorse Democrats and so forth, but basically they want right-wing Democrats to win.
Well, it's like, look at Mondale.
George McGovern's. They don't want the Jesse Jacksons.
Even
if Ralph Nader was part of the Democratic Party, they certainly don't want him and the Bernie Sanders.
Listen, they criticize Mondale for standing for nothing. But the whole reason Mondale was nominated, the whole reason he won that primary was because they had a candidate who stood for something, Jesse Jackson. And whether you think Jesse Jackson went far enough, whether you think Jesse Jackson was really a good socialist or not, whether you think Jesse Jackson might have been corrupt or might have been too liberal or whatever you can say, in the end, you had a guy who was running for president because he stood for something, who had a clear message about what he stood for. And the reason that Walter Mondale was nominated was because he didn't stand for what Jesse Jackson stood for. And what Jesse Jackson stood for was, at least on paper, the official platform of the Democratic Party. So think about that for a moment. Walter Mondale was nominated because he opposed Jesse Jackson, who was essentially running on New Deal liberalism with less racism.
Exactly. That's a perfect segue to
and the endorsement of Mondale, where they talk about Reagan being, racism with a kind and gentle smile. But did Mondale take the kind of pro-black, pro-working class platform that Jesse Jackson tried to take? No. He was specifically nominated to prevent the Democratic Party from embracing that pro-black, pro-working class platform.
That's a perfect segue. So we come now to the George H.W. Bush or Daddy Bush campaign v. Michael Dukakis. Now, before I talk about the media's role and who endorsed who, so Dukakis, is it fair to say Michael Dukakis was a? I really hate these terms, but modest liberal governor of the blue state of Massachusetts.
Once again.
And why do you think Dukakis actually lost to
Once again, Michael Dukakis was the candidate chosen for not being Jesse Jackson, with everything that entails. The main difference between 1988 and 1984 is that in 1984, the Reagan campaign realized that Jesse Jackson hadn't won. Walter Mondale had won. Whereas if you really look at the 1988 presidential campaign, even though they kept hitting Dukakis, you could tell that the Bush campaign was really running against Jesse Jackson. Especially with that.
I get exactly what you mean. Yeah.
So they didn't pretend. They didn't say, "Okay, well, we'll run against Michael Dukakis." They said, "Let's pretend Michael Dukakis is Jesse Jackson and run against Jesse Jackson."
That's actually perfect. That's actually
and really, honestly, ever since 1988, the Republicans have been running against Jesse Jackson. They've been running against a fictional Democrat who no longer exists. Well, you can make the argument if you really want to about whether Jesse Jackson was even really Jesse Jackson. But whatever position you take on whether Jesse Jackson was really Jesse Jackson or not, every Republican nominee for president since George H.W. Bush in 88 has been running against Jesse Jackson. And every Democratic nominee since 1988 has been chosen because he wasn't Jesse Jackson. If you look at our first black president, you can even see how our first black president was chosen to prevent our first black president from being someone like Jesse Jackson.
Exactly. Actually, before I talk about Jesse, let's talk about this when it comes to Dukakis. Dukakis actually got a lot of endorsements from newspapers and major ones. Again, I'm actually quite impressed how many endorsements he got. Wait. So he got the endorsements from the following: New York Times, the Des Moines Register, the Boston Globe, St. Petersburg Times, again, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Pittsburgh Gazette, the Philadelphia Daily News, the Detroit Free Press, Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and many from the South and Midwest, which I didn't list because it would take too long. The unions that supported him, major unions that supported him, were again the following: the AFL-CIO, the American Federation of Teachers, the Civil Service Employees Association, the International Longshore and Warehouse Union, the National Education Association, and even the News Guild, CWA, as well as the American Nurses Association and the League of Conservation Voters. Now, what's your response to that? And one of those, and
within
one of those, and also one of those factors where it doesn't matter. Wait, sorry.
Within the limits of milquetoast neoliberalism,
yeah,
Michael Dukakis was a really good governor of Massachusetts.
Okay.
By the standards of milquetoast neoliberalism, he did all the things that a budget hawk is supposed to do, as far as looking like he wasn't attacking the welfare state while at the same time being quote unquote fiscally responsible. The major good thing he did was sign a prison furlough bill, which allowed people to not just leave prison to work, which, that's been a thing ever since the chain gang. That's not new.
Yeah.
But what was important about the prison furlough bill that Dukakis signed into law is it let prisoners leave prison to work, make the same actual pay that they would make if they were not working in prison, and put some of that money in the bank until they got out of prison. Also allowing them to function outside of the institution while preparing to leave the institution and be free again. I mean, so if you believe, obviously I don't, but if you believe in the liberal theory of the penitentiary as a place where people who are led to feel sorry for their crimes and seek forgiveness from society and become good citizens again, then Michael Dukakis's prison furlough program was like one of the most successful programs in American history, and possibly one of the most important. Not really, because I don't give a lot of credence to milquetoast neoliberalism, but still, from a basic we need to get people in prison prepared to re-enter society perspective, if that's really what prison is for, then this furlough program is perfect, and it worked. And so is it really a coincidence that they chose to attack the successful furlough program in order to claim Michael Dukakis was Jesse Jackson and scare people?
Well, here's an interesting thing. So Dukakis did get important endorsements from members of the from important unions and newspapers.
Oh, yes.
However, if we want to talk about people who believe at face value what they read and watch, Dukakis only got 56 endorsements, whereas George H.W. Bush got a whopping, unless I miscounted wrong, 186 or 189.
And what was the biggest media image of Michael Dukakis that came out of that campaign? That awful picture of him driving the tank, where he doesn't look impressive or attractive in the ways that driving a tank is supposed to make a presidential candidate look. And as a result, it hurts him with his anti-war supporters and doesn't help him with the fascists he's pandering to.
Interesting enough, Bush, by the way, got he got, of course, many police unions, which I don't consider unions, fascist organizations. But yeah, but Bush got these were the unions that actually did support him: the International Brotherhood of Teamsters and the Marine Engineers Beneficial Association.
Yeah.
And so, all that being said, so do you think it's so Dukakis losing? Do you think that it doesn't matter that he got these specific newspapers or these specific unions to support him? Because in the end of the day, Bush's campaign really ran on, well, we ended the Cold War, the semi-popularity or the large propaganda machine of Reagan.
They ran off the media popularity of Reagan, because let's be honest, the media loved Reagan. The media loved Reagan for two reasons. They loved Reagan because he was a cuddly old grandpa who played good on TV, and they loved Reagan because he gave them lots of juicy corruption stories while at the same time being innocent enough appearing that people didn't think he himself was corrupt.
Exactly. And also, Bush also ran, like Nixon before him, like other Republicans, on the whole tough on crime nonsense, the racist dog whistling message. Do you think that played a crucial role in Bush winning over Dukakis?
Absolutely. The Reagan era, and by extension, the Bush and the Clinton era, were the prime years, up until recently again, were the prime years of pro-police state propaganda. A lot of the quote unquote prison reform that's come since has been based around the idea of somehow making the police state less horrible. And none of that has worked out very well because it's included too many privatization schemes. But even privatization, the point is prison is horrible. It exists.
Exactly. But that being said, before we talk about Jesse Jackson's two campaigns, I do have to ask this about Dukakis, because because what you said about the furlough scheme is interesting. I think you did a very good job pitching how if you're even if you're not an abolitionist, but if you are a social justice warrior, pretty good program. But I've noticed something about a lot of politicians, whether it's somebody like Jeremy Corbyn, whether it's somebody who claims that they're for Palestine justice or anything, is the inability to be proud, to have the courage of your convictions, if you know what I mean. And when some asshole right winger starts attacking you, instead of really pushing back against it, there's this kind of deer in the headlights.
Well, so you have to understand.
So Michael Dukakis, you've done a better job at explaining why his furlough program was good than Michael Dukakis himself. And I saw just several weeks ago, George H.W. Bush's debate with Michael Dukakis. Look, Dukakis wasn't bad in the debates, but he just did not really do a very good job of aggressively pushing back against Bush, who was saying, guys associated with the ACLU, he is too goddamn liberal, guys. and it just annoys me that Democrats are very bad at A, having the courage of their convictions, and B, when they are kind of hit with these stupid right-wing talking points, it's just deer in the headlights kind of response. So I'm curious your response to that.
Well, again, you can't expect somebody who ran against Jesse Jackson in the primary to suddenly embrace the ACLU in the general election, even if he is a member. I mean,
okay.
I mean, it's pretty straightforward. When your whole purpose of running in the primary is to beat, with all their flaws and all their baggage, if the only reason you're running in the primary is to beat Jesse Jackson or Bernie Sanders, you can't then go and try to run as Jesse Jackson or Bernie Sanders in the general election.
Exactly.
The person who came closest to running as Bernie Sanders in the general election, despite beating him, was Joe Biden. And even Joe Biden kept saying things like, I'm the guy who beat the socialist. It was only the media that was making Joe Biden out to be Bernie Sanders.
That's actually a perfect segue to this. One quick thing though about George H.W. Bush, who tried to ran as being a much more moderate Republican, whatever the fuck that means. It's a very empty term, in my opinion. But he did try to run, I'm going to be a friend of the environment and stuff like that. But,
so George H.W. Bush.
But when we talk about the media, I think this kind of goes back to Jeff Cohen, the founder of Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, when he describes corporate media, whether it's television, radio, or the newspapers and magazines, as the following. You're allowed to be from center right to far right.
Yeah.
And George H.W. Bush, like Reagan before, okay, if they got a bunch of newspapers endorsing them, it doesn't matter because Reagan had the Christian right get involved in politics. George H.W. Bush had these right-wing think tanks and whatnot, but also it was also the rise of far-right radio like the Rush Limbaughs of the world. And once you get their endorsements, like
it's even simpler than that. It's simpler than that. It is the normalization of the beliefs of quote-unquote fringe groups like the John Birch Society, which other Republicans used to not want to touch, being normalized by the Rush Limbaughs. Yeah. So you've got this thing where all of a sudden, all of these hate group positions that were verboten as being too close to Nazism during the Cold War are mainstream Republicanism again.
Interesting. Very interesting.
By mainstream Republicanism, I mean mainstream Dixiecratism.
Exactly. And yes, and who can forget the fucking Willie Horton ad? Let's talk about the Jesse Jackson one. I was pleasantly surprised when, in researching the Jesse Jackson campaign, because one can't talk, and this is what I wrote in my notes. So now one can't talk about that period of time, the 80s and the early 90s, without talking about the Democratic primaries and the rebel insurgent candidacy of Jesse Jackson in 1982 and 1988. As you mentioned, for many leftists and for many black radical leftists, like members or those who read Black Agenda Report, Hood Communism, Black Liberation Media, Black Power Media, and Your World News, the name Jesse Jackson will elicit a response that he's often a sellout, a member of the Black misleadership class. For others on the broad left, however, historically speaking, for others on the broad left, Jackson's two campaigns and what he's done since shows that there's no changing the Democrats to making it into a truly left-wing party. That said, you got to give credit where credit is due. Jackson got third place in the Democratic primaries when it ended up being Walter Mondale, and second place in the 1988 primaries when it ended up being Dukakis. Yeah. Now, sadly, many of his wonderful policies twice didn't even make it to the party manifesto, apart from some left-leaning healthcare reform or expanding Medicare and Medicaid to the largely working class or working poor.
Yeah. Jesse Jackson was saying, let's expand Medicare to cover everyone back in 1984.
So, and also, when reading his proposals in his campaigns, I'm impressed actually how much he tried to reach out to the queer community, Native Americans, Arab and other West Asian Americans, Hispanics, Latinx families, and Latinx peoples, family farmers. And while he didn't call for an end to the war on drugs, he certainly wanted to radically soften it.
Well, let's talk about
not engage in the whole tough on crime right-wing chauvinist nonsense.
Let's talk about the civil rights tradition that Jesse Jackson was really running on, because I want to talk about this.
But before that, he also very early on called for reparations to black people who are descendants of slaves. Yes. He ran twice on reversing the Reagan-inspired tax cuts for the richest 10% of Americans and using the money to finance social welfare programs. He proposed cutting the budget of the Department of Defense by 15% over the course of his administration. Again, supporting family farmers, reviving many of FDR's New Deal farm programs, creating a single-payer system of universal health care. For feminists, he believed in ratifying the Equal Rights Amendment and, again, increasing federal funding for lower-level public education, free community college to all, and applying stricter enforcement of the Voting Rights Act and supporting the formation of a Palestinian state.
I have some questions for you. First question: in what city and state was Jesse Jackson's political organization based?
The Rainbow Push Coalition, correct.
That's going to be my next question. Well, that's what it was called, yes. Where was it based? Yeah. Where is it based technically still now? Because technically it still exists.
I don't know, but I'm going to take a wild guess. Either New York or California?
Chicago, Illinois.
That's interesting. That's actually
now what other Rainbow Coalition was based in Chicago, Illinois, and who founded it?
The original Rainbow Coalition of Fred Hampton.
Why was Fred Hampton killed?
Well, because he was trying to do a version of what Jesse was doing, which is uniting all the poor people, regardless of skin color and whatnot, and also saying to them, guys, fuck this New Deal stuff. We gotta replace capitalism.
What was that thing? What was that thing that I said Orville Faubus was running on in Arkansas? You got to help the poor black man, because you help the poor black man, it's going to help you too.
Yeah.
And that's what and you know, he wanted to help everybody because he said, you help everybody, you'll help everybody.
And also important to know this about Jesse Jackson. Now, people can make, and again, you can make all legitimate criticisms that people do make about Jesse Jackson from the left, but he was part of Martin Luther King Jr.'s organization.
But that's not the criticism.
His two campaigns to be leader of the Democrats was a version of Martin Luther King Jr.'s Poor People's campaign.
Yes. He was trying to combine the Rainbow Coalition and the MLK civil rights movements, and hitch them together and have one big tent social justice movement, as opposed to a big tent anti-social justice movement.
So that being said, talk about the corporate media and PBS's coverage of Jesse Jackson and why you think Jesse lost. Also, what do you think gets completely overlooked about the Jesse Jackson campaign?
Well, what gets completely overlooked is the fact that he did his third place and second place finishes in 84 and 88 with absolutely no institutional support from the Democratic Party. He had one endorsement from a serious national Democrat, and that serious national Democrat was Orville fucking Faubus. The quote-unquote respectable Democrats, the ones who supposedly supported all the things Jackson was talking about, were doing everything they could to try to crush Jesse Jackson. The mainstream media treated Jesse Jackson the way they treated everything in the Reagan area, which is to say black equals crime/corruption. And every sexual or money-related scandal that could possibly be connected to Jesse Jackson's political organizing was in a way that, nobody has ever focused on the personal scandals of a white Republican the way they have focused on the personal scandals of black Democrats. There were racketeering probes opened into Jesse Jackson's organization by the white Democratic city government of Chicago in ways that were intended to help people in the Democratic primaries, but ended up helping Republicans. I mean, it's gross.
When researching about Jesse Jackson, I actually take offense to what I used to hear about people say about the Jesse Jackson campaign, that it was too much focused on black people when that's
it was literally he was literally playing that Rainbow Coalition card hard. He was talking to everybody. It wasn't just black people. He was, like you said, farmers, women, queer people. He wanted to scale back the drug war. He wanted to increase everything across the board in the welfare state. I mean,
but that said, because I mentioned to you.
But that's the thing, is that the welfare state was synonymous with black people when Jesse Jackson was a candidate. The welfare state may still be synonymous with black people for most voters. I don't know. Maybe that's the problem. I know for a fact that white Democrats were getting hostile to the welfare state because they thought that it was helping poor black people too much and not helping middle-class white people enough.
It's was Jesse good though when they came to the media attacks? Was Jesse good at pushing back against the right-wing talking points, the bullshit that was thrown at him?
Jesse Jackson was as good or bad at handling the media as Martin Luther King Jr. was as good or bad as handling the media, which is to say he actually came off extremely well in the media most of the time, but every effort was made in the media to poison his image.
But how much
the media hated Jesse Jackson? He was very effective as a speaker. I mean, you don't do well despite the media hating you if your pushback isn't reasonably effective. But it's like Bernie Sanders. He was the most hated person in America when it came to the ruling class and elite. Now, you can argue whether he was really as against them as he pretended or not, all you want. He never won, so there's no way of knowing. But
exactly.
I mean, they hated him because of the things he spoke up for, whether he was really for them or not.
Exactly.
Just like Bernie Sanders if you say even a few good things, they will completely ignore your deals with the devil to keep them happy. Look at how AOC has progressively moved further right from the very beginning, and yet the establishment Democrats still hate her.
Yeah. And then the far right still thinks of her as a threat, even though but that's their stupid cultish attitudes.
Well, the far right, it's like I was saying.
But that said, and again, I say this as somebody who follows, many of the black left outlets and black online publications who spent a lot of time criticizing Jesse Jackson for legitimate reasons. But when researching Jesse Jackson, this guy actually does not get enough credit for the campaign he was trying to
1988.
He got third place against Mondale, second place when it was Dukakis.
When he came in second against Dukakis, he was coming in second against Dukakis despite the entire Democratic establishment being against him, for the simple reason, again, he's the one most speaking to what the Democratic voters want and what the general election voters need. And what do the Republicans do? They run against Dukakis like he's Jesse Jackson.
But how much did the whole Jaime scandal, the anti-Semitic comment he apparently made that New York is filled with too much Jews and it's too much of a Jaime town or something like that? How
talk like that?
Huh?
People used to talk like that. He's of the right generation where he might have said something like that, and he was probably saying it in reference to things like ruling class money and support for Israel, and he probably shouldn't have said things like that. But I mean, so the media, because of its very acute pro-Israel radar, has very acute anti-Semitism radar.
Exactly.
I mean, if you want to hear anti-Semitism, you can listen to the Nixon tapes and hear Nixon say all the things Jesse Jackson said. But I never heard the media go out of its way to say Nixon was anti-Semitic the way they went out of their way to say Jesse Jackson was anti-Semitic. In fact, Kanye West is anti-Semitic, but Kanye West gets more shit for his real anti-Semitism than any white Nazi you can think of gets for his. Why do you think that is? I don't even like Kanye West.
True.
But there will always be more people calling black candidates anti-Semitic than white candidates for the simple reason that, remember what James Baldwin said? We're not anti-Semitic, we're anti-white. Calling black people anti-Semitic is sort of a code to suggest they might not be nice to rich white people.
Which there's
because let's be honest.
There's some truth to that.
Let's be honest, though. Let's be honest. When can you tell whether your landlord,
as Chris Rock famously said in his Bigger and Blacker stand-up special, which is great, which is a great show. He talked about Louis Farrakhan and Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton, and he said, now Farrakhan's got a problem with the Jews. Look, we'll have a problem against Jews. I have a problem against all white people. And what it really means is, look, we hate the white supremacy. If you're going to be assholes to us, don't expect us to differentiate any of you, because we're against. If
you look historically, now I'm going to stay away from social projects for a moment and focus just on class.
Yeah.
If you look at the question of class, Jewish people are one of the least oppressed minorities in America from a class basis.
Yeah.
There is a strong social prejudice against Jewish people by many American Christians that is deliberately repressed and even overcompensated for in order to make American Christians look and sound pro-Jewish, when really it's all about being pro-Israel.
Yeah.
It's like the Jewish Defense League doesn't care about defending the lives of individual Jewish people. The Jewish Defense League cares about sending settlers to Israel, and the right kind of settlers with the right politics.
Yeah. And when we talk about, and also when we talk about white supremacist groups, white nationalist groups, there really are two kinds of that school of thought. There is the old school Nazi white supremacist that does hate Jewish people for Judeo-Bolshevism. They killed Christ, blah 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 blah.
But what did Theodore Herzl?
There are some that still cling on to that.
But what did Theodore Herzl say about genuine anti-Semites? What did Theodore Herzl say about genuine anti-Semites and Zionism? Anti-Semites are going to be our best friends. They're going to want us to go to Palestine more than anyone else.
Yeah, exactly. And then and nowadays like openly white nationalist, white supremacist groups, many of them who of course are part of the Christian right organization, they might still harbor, and many of them do still harbor, their stupid like anti-Semitic stuff because of their Christianity. But really, they love Zionism. They think Israel is the perfect model of white supremacy. You're eradicating brown indigenous people there, and and also all the white Jews are going to go to Israel like eventually. And then of course there's the theological reasons that when the end of the world comes and Jesus comes down, all the Jews are going to convert to Christianity, and Israel needs to be in the hands of the mostly white Jews, not in these heathen brown Muslims, even though there are Palestinian Christians, but the racism blocks them from that. And Israel needs to be in the hands of the white settlers. And
the barbarism and savagery and inhumanity of Muslims has been a core belief to justify white supremacy and colonialism as long as white supremacy and colonialism have existed. We are civilizing people. Kipling has a poem about it.
Oh, yeah. White Man's Burden, right?
Harry Belafonte stole that name for a great movie.
That is a great movie. Yes, that is a good movie. I like that movie. Yes.
That is the, but at the same time, the same people who criticized Green Book criticized White Man's Burden for being, too much about white people. But Harry Belafonte has always been at the basic, what it comes down to, and I don't care how much other black people don't like about it. If you want to talk about racism and you want to make people less racist, your message has to go to white people because they're the racist ones.
Yeah. So that's interesting. Anyways, another thing I have to add about the Jesse Jackson campaign and why I think it was very cruel that Jesse didn't get the support that he should have gotten from a lot of people. And again, you can criticize.
He didn't get the support that he should have from the very strongly entrenched black people in Congress who all claim to come out of the same civil rights movement as him.
Oh, is that true?
Well, you look at those. If you look at those lists of Democrats endorsing people, well, where were the endorsements from our Maxine Waters and our John Lewises?
And then very good point.
He was a mayor back then. Where's Jesse Jackson's endorsement from Mayor Tom Bradley of Los Angeles?
Did he get the endorsement of when Jesse ran twice? Did he get the endorsement of a John Conyers, who once upon a time was even proud to call himself a socialist?
He did not. He might have gotten a John Conyers endorsement. Actually,
let me check quickly. It's actually an interesting question.
I know there were a few black Democrats of stature who did endorse Jesse Jackson because he was Jesse Jackson. But they were more of the John Conyers and Julian Bond types than they were the John Lewis and Elijah Cummings types.
Fascinating.
The reason I mentioned Julian Bond is because when Julian Bond was running for the congressional seat that John Lewis held when he passed away, John Lewis's campaign said Julian Bond was a cokehead and a criminal who couldn't be trusted near power. And this is how surviving heroes of the civil rights movement were talking about each other to impress white Democrats.
Unfucking believable, Jesus. Okay, wait, hold up. Well, Jesse didn't get a lot of endorsements from elected people, period.
No.
Look, in 1988, I think the only newspaper and publication that even endorsed him, even though I'm not a fan of this magazine, but hey, credit where it's due, was The Nation magazine.
Well, yeah, the Nation, whether you really like everything they publish or not, and whether you think they're too liberal or not, The Nation is the quote unquote magazine of the left. They endorsed Jesse Jackson, and they endorsed Bernie Sanders.
In 88, when Jesse ran in 88, Ernest Hollings of South Carolina endorsed him.
Yeah.
As you mentioned, overall Favis.
Orville Faubus.
And
yeah.
the only local officials that that supported him was Harold Washington, mayor of Chicago,
Mm-hmm.
and our frenemy or enemy, whatever, the mayor of Burlington, Vermont at the time.
Bernie Sanders.
Exactly.
Bernie Sanders and Harold Washington, and were the two biggest elected officials to support Jesse Jackson.
And I forgot the name of the we were talking earlier about my disapproval of how Hunter S. Thompson joined in on the bullying of the McGovern campaign when it came to his running mates who had mental health issues. When it came to Jesse Jackson, I have to say this: even though he's my hero, just doing all this research into Jesse Jackson, I now really can't stand how he attacked him. But Frank Zappa had a protest song against Jesse Jackson and was calling him a swindler and was joining in on the very orchestrated smear campaigns of Jesse Jackson, that he purposely, when Martin Luther King Jr. was murdered, that Jesse purposely put blood on himself to make him look.
Yeah, there was a lot of anti-Jesse stuff going on. Some of the worst stuff.
Yeah, and again, and look, I like Frank Zappa, but like Hunter S. Thompson, that was not him. That was him as one of his shittiest moments. One of his shittiest moments.
No, I mean, stuff like that happens, sadly. Most quote unquote leftist hero rock stars are depressingly liberal.
In fact, funny that you even mentioned that. Zappa, in one of his interviews when he was asked about the presidential campaign, Zappa was fierce in his criticisms towards Ronald Reagan. Thank God for that, because not many people were. But when it came to talking about the presidential bids, he attacked Jesse in a very cheap way, like, Jesse's a priest. I don't really trust religious figures, which is what the fuck, dude? And then was propping up Mario Cuomo, even though Mario Cuomo had no interest in even running, apart from just making one good speech at the Democratic convention. But then Cuomo was basically supportive of whoever was going to be the establishment right-wing Democrats in the end. So
the only way Cuomo would have been a candidate is if Jackson had ended up beating everybody else in primaries. Cuomo wasn't on any primary ballots. They could have added him to the second ballot at the convention, though.
Yeah, and so sadly, and with the fall of Michael Dukakis, the memo that was given to the Democrats, even though the Democrats still very right wing and was still pivoting more and more to the right,
run away from Jesse Jackson.
The Republicans were going even more far right than they were already.
The Republicans
the Democrats were pivoting more and more from being a center left, and we're talking strictly narrow.
The Republicans have been running against the Democratic Party like they are Jesse Jackson since 1988, and the Democrats have been running away from Jesse Jackson since 1984.
And we get into the dawn of the Clinton, the rise of Bill Clinton, and interestingly enough, because I am going to be going to the UK for a period of time, a lot of the whole New Labour stuff and the Tony Blair stuff and the constant talking about the middle class this and the middle class that was all copied from the Clinton campaign.
Who was Margaret Thatcher's most successful protege? Tony Blair.
And she even takes credit for that. She says, she says, look, my greatest legacy is New Labour. I made the Labour Party.
Yes.
Even though again, the Labour Party always was at best, and I'm being way too generous towards them, a center-right party compared to the Tories, who I always feel were a far-right party. But
You look at her election. Her election was what Reagan was copying. Jimmy Carter was trying not to be Jimmy Callahan, but ended up being worse than Jimmy Callahan, who at least folded, even though he fought the strike, which he never should have done. At least Jimmy Callahan folded to the winter of discontent assholes.
Yeah.
Margaret Thatcher broke the coal miners' strike.
Fortunately.
The winter of our discontent was the last successful labor action, mass labor action in the UK. The Labour Party fought it, lost to it, and then ended up empowering the Tories because they chose to represent the boss instead of their own constituents.
Now, interestingly enough, though, all that being said, I still think even if he lost, I still think Labour, if it was Tony Benn against Margaret Thatcher twice, Labour would have had a better.
Tony Benn. I mean, again,
the compromise candidate was
Neil Kinnock. Neil Kinnock is the guy who ended up running against Thatcher. I know Neil Kinnock ran.
No. You're skipping too far ahead. There's Michael Foot. Michael Foot was the
the first guy
who definitely was not made for television or anything like that. Then came Neil Kinnock. And then after that, the Labour Party only goes more and more to the.
Well, I remember Neil Kinnock because Neil Kinnock had the balls to say that if he won, he was going to take all the nuclear missile silos out of the UK and send it back to the Americans. Now, because of that campaign promise, this is the most important influence that I know of that any British politician has ever had on what we can think of as American comics. Even though it's still a British comic, it ended up in American culture and became a very big American movie. Alan Moore, the great comic book writer, was so sure that Neil Kinnock was going to beat Margaret Thatcher that he invented a dystopian future based on what the future would look like if the missile silos were taken out of the UK and so the Russians didn't shoot the UK during the nuclear war. And the result was a comic book called V for Vendetta.
But it sounds to me as if Alan Moore, who I know is on the record of being an anarchist, but it sounds to me as if he's more of a right-wing anarchist.
No, he loved Neil Kinnock. Right. He was sure that Neil Kinnock was going to win, but because he's an anarchist and he doesn't believe that reform is actually going to make anything better, his prediction was Neil Kinnock would win. They would pull the nuclear missile silos out of the UK. The US and USSR would destroy each other with missiles, and what you would have left would be a dystopian fascist government in the UK.
And then V's going to save us all, right?
And V is, if you read V for Vendetta, it's less save us all than it is inspire people to start thinking about what is necessary to save themselves. Okay. V for Vendetta ends. You sort of see this in the comic book, in the movie, but you have to read the comic book to understand the ending. You remember the character Dominic from the movie, the cop's sidekick?
Yes, yeah.
So in the comic book, V dies in the same situation as in the movie, Viking funeral as they blow up Parliament. But V dies, Evie becomes V, and the very end of the comic book is Evie dressed as V, kidnapping Dominic and locking him up the same way V kidnapped her and locked her up.
To radicalize her.
Yes. So you see her going out of her way to radicalize the cop sidekick the same way V went out of his way to radicalize her. And then the very last scene of the comic book is there's a subplot in the comic book that isn't touched upon as much in the movie, where as things break down, the fascists are double crossing each other to become more important progressively. And whereas you see Mr. Creedy double crossing the boss, in the comic book, there are a series of double crosses that come before that. And one particular character's wife keeps switching to whomever the new strongman is and convincing them to try to take over. So the very last scene in the movie is her trying to convince the cop that she can marry him and they can still take over the government. And he's wandering down the street like a crazy person dressed like a bum, and he just walks past her, pretends she's not even there.
Interesting. Interesting. Which reminds me, gotta get myself a copy of V for Vendetta.
But I recommend everyone read V for Vendetta, because that's what Alan Moore thought would happen. That Kinnock would pull the missile silos, and there would be a great liberal victory. But of course, because of a great labor victory, but of course, because of the limits of reform, the USSR and USA would still nuke each other, and the result would be a fascist takeover in the UK under the auspices of saving the nation from apocalypse.
So fascinating. Now, wasn't planning on talking about, the rise of Clinton. I know why Al Gore lost. Bush cheated.
Well, Al Gore lost for two reasons. Number one, Bush cheated.
Exactly.
Number two, and even more importantly than Bush cheating, the political establishment was very much poised to prefer the vocally religious son of an oil executive and a former oil executive himself, even if he failed at it, to a presidential candidate saying that we have to seriously constrain the most profitable industry in the United States because of the environment. Let's remember that the popularity of South Park was primarily making fun of global warming and Al Gore.
Very much so, very much so. And one of these days, we actually have to do a program, because I am noticing on social media, more and more people are talking about how South Park is an animated far-right junk satire cartoon.
Well, remember, Matt Stone and Trey Parker brag about not being Republicans or Democrats, but libertarians.
Exactly. And what's a libertarian? Well, I think it's very revealing. The answers are in and of itself.
A libertarian is a KKK member too polite to wear his hood in public.
And it's Matt Stone saying the following: I hate liberals. No. I hate liberals and conservatives, but I really, really hate liberals. Yeah. Basically, I really hate liberals more. And liberals, for our international audience, in the context, is basically anyone who's to the left of Bernie Sanders, basically.
Yeah. Or, even anybody as far left as Bernie Sanders who's slightly to the right of where Jesse Jackson was.
Exactly. And
Jesse Jackson was willing to be vocally anti-Israel in a way Bernie Sanders has never been.
Exactly. And I think also, the Democrats under Clinton and Gore was very much like it really.
Well, who's Clinton? Clinton is the anti-Jesse Jackson formula that the Democrats were looking for this whole time. He's not Jesse Jackson, but he still wins.
His Sister Soldier moment, he did that right.
Yes.
Right in front of a conference, Jesse Jackson was.
Yes, that was the whole point.
For office, Jesse was not running for office against Bill Clinton. There lots of people get that wrong, and Clinton felt the need to eviscerate Sister Soldier. This was at the height of the Rodney King uprisings, and basically his Sister Soldier moment was, "Hey Jesse, you're gonna condemn these far left black activists of yours?" And Jesse, instead of really pushing back against this constant deer in the headlights response that a lot of left-leaning people have. And Jesse's response was like, yes,
You
I
remember?
will.
You remember when John Lewis died, and Bill Clinton used a eulogy for John Lewis as an excuse to piss on the memory of Stokely Carmichael?
Bill Clinton, a fucking right-wing asshole of the
I mean,
highest caliber.
Bill Clinton was the Joe Biden type candidate that people don't hate the way they hate Joe Biden that the Democrats needed.
Yeah.
And Bill Clinton was able to be a likable scumbag in just the right way to make people think that he was JFK and not Ronald Reagan.
I thought this is interesting. You were talking about how Jesse Jackson didn't get even the endorsements of the very people who should have supported him, the Congressional Black Caucus.
Well, remember, you got to, yeah.
And so forth. But boy, were they ready to endorse Bill Clinton and prop him up. Bill Clinton gets to go on Arsenio and play the stupid saxophone as if he's one with the crowd.
And Toni Morrison, a great writer who many people legitimately respect for her work, despite the limits of literary and academic liberalism. Toni Morrison said Bill Clinton was the first black president.
And then, funnily enough, even though I didn't do a deep dive into this, but even though McGovern and Mondale and Michael Dukakis and Jesse Jackson, he tried his insurgent candidacy twice, even though a lot of notable Hollywood celebrities, white Hollywood celebrities, like Jack Nicholson and so forth, even though all these people like Shirley MacLaine and so forth all supported the Mondales of the world, the Michael Dukakis, and even Jesse Jackson, it didn't get the attention it gotten. But this goes to the power of corporate media, the power of the media and state media. When Clinton was wooing and dining and trying to get Hollywood celebrities, all of a sudden that mattered. All of a sudden, people gave a shit about that because the media was like, look at all of these
people used to attack Hollywood liberals because of Paul Newman. And so, I mean, there was always these Hollywood liberals. But you're right. Bill Clinton was the first Hollywood liberal in the Democratic Party to really go Hollywood himself.
Well, right-wing
Hollywood. He was the first celebrity president, even before, second after JFK. But he was very much a celebrity president in the same way JFK and Barack Obama were.
And the funny thing is, now, if not for the ridiculous far-right media attacking Bill Clinton as if he was a socialist, which we later see a repeat of this when Obama becomes president.
Mm-hmm. They're still running against Jesse Jackson when Bill Clinton is president.
But if not for that, the response though during Clinton's reign of terror should have been the left mobilizing against Clinton, just like Obama. But because the far right was so cartoonish and over the top in their attacks of Clinton,
people believe that Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton might have been good people for a little while. People made the mistake that if Republicans hated Hill and Hillary so much, they must be good people.
Exactly, and it's the same exact problem that we have that we had during the Obama years.
Well, I mean, now the problem we have is anybody who's a Democrat must be a good person because they're not a Republican, unless they're a progressive Democrat, in which they must be a bad person because progressives are bad. And yet no one opposes Republicans except progressives. So if Republicans are bad, how can progressives be bad?
But do you think because of the rise of far-right media, Reagan getting rid of the fairness doctrine, which I don't think would have made that much of a difference.
Here's what I'll say about the media.
Yeah.
I've got an answer to your far-right media question ready. The German Red Army fraction included the right-wing Axel Springer media empire as part of their legitimate enemy ruling class to target. Axel Springer was the enemy to the Red Army fraction. I think one of the fundamental things that we have to understand on the left is whatever we think of Democrats, Fox News, Tucker Carlson et al. Are the enemy of the working class. We have to be as sure about Fox News and Tucker Carlson as the German Red Army fraction was sure about Axel Springer. And all other far-right media, too.
Huh?
And all other far-right media, too. Which means the mainstream media, which is very far-right, despite pretending to be liberal.
Exactly. But now, because do you think even if during the Mondale, Dukakis, and the Clinton years, even if there was liberal, loudmouth and so forth, it wouldn't have made a difference because we see on YouTube, we're overpopulated with lots of YouTube people who act as if they're left wing. Mm-hmm. But when push really comes to shove, they don't support the Dennis Kuciniches of the world, the Mike Gravells of the world. There was a period where, of course, they supported Bernie Sanders, but at the end of the day, they are loyal Democrats, even if they might attack Democrats.
Since you mentioned Mike Gravel, I have to say that the Gravel teens are working for an AI company now. So
that's scary.
Yeah. So the young kids who reached out to Mike Gravel to make their mark on politics have become, just another bunch of tech scammers.
That probably was a psyop in and of itself. We target someone who is legitimately, sincerely left wing. We target him. We groom him. Whenever he dies or is not of use to us, we just basically get people into our far right online world and so forth.
And that seems there's a lot of that going around. Yes, is like that expropriating of legacies, the way every black liberal in Congress says they're Martin Luther King.
Well, because I think history, it would have been interesting if Mondale became president. It would have been interesting if Dukakis became president, but whatever. All that being said, the problem with whatever you call the left, whether it's organized labor, the education, the free education or affordable education movement and so forth, is even though the people who claim that they want single-payer health care, a compassionate welfare state, if not anti-imperialism, they're certainly selective in what wars they're against. But when push comes to shove, they still always end up being loyal Democrats, no matter how much the Democrat moves to the right. And the reason why I talk about the YouTube left world is, look, we're overpopulated with countless people who claim to be left wing and so forth, but they just always end up.
What's the point of subversive media if subversive media just serves to reinforce a bunch of tropes you get from mainstream media?
And look, like when we talk about the Obama years, which is a whole nother episode in and of itself, my bullshit detector knew that this was a boring, uninspiring, centrist windbag of the highest order. But talk about the power of the media and so forth. The media treated him as if he was this kind of second coming of FDR, or at least JFK, as you mentioned. But Obama was just a right-wing Democrat of the highest order. And many people propped him up. Look, the TYTs of the world, the majority reporters of the world, many The Nation magazine. Many people who later joined the rebranded MSNBC were all Obama cult followers.
You can talk to we can talk again about TYT if and when Cenk Uygur disassociates himself from Rebellion PAC and Brianna Wu. And until then, we're just going to assume TYT is just like MSNBC.
Exactly. Look, and credit where it's due. Credit where it's due. TYT did support. Look, they have a large audience. In fact, I'm even surprised how much people who are subscribers to my program are also subscribers to the Majority Report in TYT.
Well, I mean,
so credit where credit is due. They do have a very large audience. They do purposely market themselves and target people who are, if not sincerely left-wing, let's just say they're very left-leaning, and they did support Bernie Sanders' campaign twice, and Bernie was the left insurgent candidate. But when it all comes down to it, opposition, and they do want you to always be loyal Democrats in the end of the day.
I mean, it goes back a long way. The outfit,
like the Nation magazine in a nutshell.
The Nation magazine is a good example. I'm thinking of someone even Roots Action. That's the one. Roots Action. That's the one I'm thinking of.
Rootsaction.org.
Yes, rootsaction.org. Rootsaction.org is founded by people who have been saying, well, it's just too dangerous to elect a Republican for so many years. They finally separated themselves from Joe Biden in 2022, 2023, 2024 because of why? Palestine.
But that being said, and I've had one of the co-founders of Roots Action on the program many times, Jeff Cohen, and Jeff does great media criticism's work, but anyways,
the Democrats are who we've got. You're the only ones who can win an election. You got to support them.
Exactly. And historically, me and him, we had a polite disagreement about Ralph Nader's rebel candidates, and I still find myself also disagreeing with them. That being said, when it came to Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump, I think if I was in the U.S., I probably would have held my nose very tightly and just voted for Kamala Harris because I really do not like the fucking animated far-right movement of Donald Trump. But that being said, any other time in history, I would have proudly voted for, a Ralph Nader or a Jill Stein or a Cynthia McKinney and so forth. But look, even when Dennis Kucinich and Mike Gravel were the rebel candidates, a lot of those outstanding media critics, people who work in genuinely sincere independent media or certainly nonprofit media, were all gung-ho for John Edwards and Barack Obama.
I just picture the same thing every time, and these are probably not the right characters for the anecdote, but it's just such a good example that I can't not say it. I just always picture Bayard Rustin sitting somewhere with Malcolm X, eating sandwiches, and Malcolm X saying, no, you got it all wrong. You don't change the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party changes you. And I mean, that's what's happened. A whole lot of people have been changed by the Democratic Party since deciding they were liberal Democrats.
Yeah. But then, then
I think your connection's starting to go in and out a little now.
I think
Yeah, I think you're going to get disconnected in a moment.
Sort of in closing, do you think that... Oh, is it my internet problem or yours?
It looks like it's yours from what I can tell. You seem to be cutting in and out. Hopefully Youri will have this cleaned up in a moment. I'm glad that it didn't happen until near the end. I was about ready to ask for final thoughts anyway. Youri's going to be right back as soon as he can, and we'll try to get wrapped up. And I hope everybody who's been watching today has enjoyed
it. Can you see me now?
I can see and hear you now for a moment. And
okay, how about now? How about now? Can you hear me now?
It's going in and out.
Okay.
There's a lag now. All right. And while we're waiting for Youri to come back, I just want to thank him for joining us. Thank everyone for watching us. I will be back again next week. Next week, we will have Nate from the Collective Action Comics podcast on, and we're going to talk about his show, his podcast, why you should watch the old episodes, why you should watch the current episodes, why you should watch the new season when Collective Action Comics comes back. Hey, welcome back, Youri.
Okay. So I think, so just in closing, sorry about that, folks. So just in closing, actually, what do you think is the lesson learned from McGovern, Mondale, Dukakis, and the Dukakis? Because the Democratic establishment, right-leaning Democrats, or even liberal Democrats would say that we have to have more of the Obamas and the Clintons, the centrists.
I think the lessons I think that the lessons to be learned here are that the Democrats chose not to support, and I mean this institutionally, I mean elected Democrats, I mean media Democrats, I mean the media elites who often provide the rationales for the Democrats. All of them decided that, we've gone too far. We can't let these George McGovern, Jesse Jackson, Bernie Sanders candidates have any power. We have to keep people who the donors like up front. And I think that's the real lesson more than anything else. It's the lesson isn't from the losses of McGovern and Mondale and Dukakis. The lesson is RFK Jr. getting shot, George McGovern having no institutional support for his own party, and the Democratic Party from 1984 forward having no real principles other than we don't want Jesse Jackson to be president.
So it does go back to that in the end, that the Democrats are.
Because we don't want McGovern to win. If McGovern wins, we might have to deliver on his promises. We don't want Jackson to win. If Jackson wins, we might have to deliver on his promises. We don't want Bernie Sanders to win. If Bernie Sanders wins, we might have to deliver on his promises. Note how when Obama and Biden and Clinton all won, they did everything they could to destroy the idea that anything in the Democratic Party platform was actually achievable.
So it does go back to the fact, in a nutshell. Look, the Democrats are part of the Democrats are part of the problem.
The Democrats are part of the problem,
and long overdue that people power movements. Abandon the Democrats, and if you're not going to join the Greens or the PSL, you certainly got to start a whole new left party, and you got to get money out of politics. That's just one big issue.
But anytime, and I hate to say this because it sounds like you're justifying a lot of slurs, but anytime, and this is important to remember when Democrats get up and applaud Trump saying things like this, references towards socialism in American politics are fundamentally anti-black every time. When people attack socialism, they're attacking the idea of human egalitarianism. And more than anything else, that's anti-black, anti-immigrant, anti-queer, anti-disabled.
And also, the Republican Party only goes further and further to the right. So bad enough that you can talk about some of the good stuff of communism and you engage in anti-communist leftism, but that's not enough. You then have to go. You then have to go after even the term liberalism and so forth.
Yes.
So that's become a dirty word, and then you have to use this stupid, vague term of progressivism and so forth. And now it's just stupid. I wouldn't even call it a war, but if there is a fake war, it's the war between progressivism, which I guess is supposed to be left, and our centrist windbags.
Well, the idea is that the belief is that progressivism is the future, and that progressivism will inevitably win because we're right. And I'm not sure that the idea that we'll win because we're right is something that we can rely on. We'll win if we fight hard enough.
And that also requires a mass decoupling of corporate media. And it also means, and also we also have to be careful of what to plagiarize Thatcher. We also have to fight a lot of the enemies from within, and there are a lot of controlled opposition leftists who are part of the problem.
I don't know. I mean, there are a lot of people who just can't break free of liberal thinking, is the way that I would put it. I don't like to accuse anybody of being false flag or false opposition. It's just you've got people who are not effective opposition because they do not understand the principles of opposition. The Lord of Bolingbroke, who was the guy who wrote the manual for the court opposition parties to the crown under the Stuarts, basically said, number one, you have to oppose the people you're opposed to. You can't cooperate with them. You have to oppose them all the time, period. Even if you support what they do, you have to explain why you oppose them. And second, and this is the even most important part, you have to be prepared to do something differently when you take power.
Exactly.
And I think that's really a great note. Bolingbroke was kind of a Tory, but in fact, literally, the party he belonged to was the Tories. So he was a Tory. What?
Was he a One Nation Tory though, or?
Well, since you're saying it, no, because in the end he defected to the Jacobites and lost his political standing and ended up a persona non grata.
Interesting.
He wanted the old pretender or the young pretender, and not the Hanoverians.
Well, I think a lot of people who follow both of our programs and so forth would be very happy that the conclusion we made is sort of, there ain't no change in Democrats. You got to rebel against.
Ultimately, in the end, even if you wanted to change Democrats, you would have to change Democrats by doing the sort of things that Martin Luther King did in order to draw attention to an issue for politicians to do something about it. And that's not enough anymore. Now you actually have to oppose the state. We're getting to the point where the meaningful opposition right now is protecting people from being arrested and disappeared by secret government agents. And that's what I'd like everybody to take home as we finish. Do you have any final thoughts?
No, just that... Thank you so much for this. I originally actually wanted to have you on 1+1 to actually do a history episode about these three.
Well, we need to do that anyway. I need to come on 1+1 again.
Yeah, but thanks for the invitation. I'm glad I got to see you before before I go on my summer vacation to the wonderful UK. Love the UK. Hate the politics though. My home away from it's my home away from home as
I love
as
everything.
living in Belgium and so
I
forth.
love
England's like my home away from home because
I love everything about the UK except the British and the monarchy.
Exactly. But no, thanks for this. It was a great episode. It was very great to do this wonderful episode, especially for our history buff, our lefty history buff audience. So, yeah.
I think now I will give this one anecdote. I read old boxing magazines now and then, and I was reading a story from 2007 by a British boxing writer named Gavin Evans, who was writing about the fight between Frank Bruno and Lennox Lewis. And one of the most important things for people to understand about the Bruno-Lewis rivalry in among the British heavyweights is that Frank Bruno was vocally an Englishman and kind of a Tory, in that he advocated for the sorts of things that the Tories advocated for, and generally was supportive of the Conservatives. And he was the guy, because he was really English, that the Brits embraced, because Lennox Lewis was from Jamaica and lived in Canada.
Oh, hilarious.
Frank Bruno actually used Enoch Powell sort of rhetoric in denouncing Lennox Lewis as a fake Englishman going into their fight. He doesn't live here.
Well, ain't it hilarious that the Conservative Party, the far right, the really very far right. I mean, like the Conservative Party, it used to be like very socially regressive on immigration, but basically fiscally conservative. We don't really touch social issues and give a shit about that. Now the Conservative Party, you get the worst of both worlds. They're both fiscally
Thatcherism,
socially very regressive, and the leader of the Conservative Party now is Madame Kemi Badenoch. Black.
Jimmy Badenoch, whose number one concern about civil rights is other British black people calling her an Uncle Tom.
Ghastly woman. Wow.
She actually said that. She said the worst racism that we have in our society today is other black people expecting me to care about black people and poor people because I'm black. She didn't put it that way literally, but that's what she meant.
Well, think about it. It's the South Park type of politics.
Yes.
South Park right-wing politics. What is South Park's main message when you really, really read between the lines? I know people are too busy laughing at the fart jokes and can you die, but South Park's real message when it talks about race relations.
Dang it. And this is good because I agree with him about South Park too.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes. I was going to say the real message about South Park, more than anything else, is that it's funny when we kill a child every episode. It's funny when we kill a child every episode. You shouldn't care about Kenny. Sure, he dies every episode, but nobody's really getting hurt. Who cares? Think about that, though. How is that? How does killing Kenny every episode affect how we feel about Palestinian children dying?
No, but also think about this. Why does South Park in the old VHS tapes? They had a fake interview with Trey Parker and Matt Stone, and the guy asked them, "Why does Kenny die in every episode? Why do you guys kill Kenny in every episode?" And both Matt Stone and Trey Parker said the following: "Because he's poor." Libertarianism, my friends, is fucking fascist.
Yes.
At the end of the day, no matter how many times your libertarians try to paint themselves, "Oh, guys, I'm socially liberal but fiscally conservative," at the end of the day, libertarians will vote for the most far-right douchebag.
What does fiscally conservative mean?
Right-wing Democrat like Hillary Clinton.
Well, what does fiscally conservative mean? Fiscally conservative means I want poor people to die. And on that note, I think that's the best place for us to stop now, since we keep finding something else to get started on. Thanks for joining me this week, man. I will see you around. I will see everybody else around. Once again, if you support the show, please like the show, subscribe to the show. Please consider checking out our Patreon and subscribing there. We really need the help to stay on the air. My streaming software isn't cheap. I could really use all the help I could get. Next week, I will be back with Nate from the Collective Action Comics podcast. We are going to be talking about his show and why you should watch it. His first season is a really, really great teardown of the Reagan years by bashing a really bad Justice League International comic book from the 80s. I think you guys might enjoy it. On that note, I'll see everybody next week, and we'll tweet at you.